Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, a straight story of fairies and necromancy. This is episode 476. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. Our author this month is Amelia Coulon, who is 49, the mother of two, and married 22 years to her soulmate. She has written 6 full-length completed romantic novels and continues to work on books and novellas. She has been published by Aspen House Publishing, Page & Spine, and numerous other outlets. Our narrator is Jo Bennett, a professional actor, theater educator, singer, budding voice actress, and occasional burlesque dancer hailing from the Midwest. In their regional theater exploits, they have been known to play anything from witches, gargoyles, dragons, sorceresses, and even the occasional mortal male or female when pressed. When not on stage, they can be found haunting coffee shops, jamming to Swedish occult metal on their headphones, usually with a bit of fantasy smut in hand. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. Here we go.
Something in the way. The game of selling secrets paid pretty well when it was deemed legal by the government. James Pritchard enjoyed his work, and it was all due to the bill passed in 2043 making necromancy a viable trade. Sure, he had the paperwork he needed to file with the state before he could just dig up a dead body, but raising zombies from the dead was pretty cool. He opened up a storefront in 2073 to drum up tourist business. He owned property rights on the outer edge of the main route going into town in North Conway, New Hampshire. His grandparents had run an antique store from the long, narrow log cabin, but they left the place to him when they decided they wanted to retire and travel. That's when Pritchard's all-seeing private eye was created. He didn't bother to pave the dirt parking lot or update the rickety wooden steps leading up to the building. He was cheap, and he figured people would consider it charmingly old-fashioned. Of course, he made certain security, and the building computers were the closest to top-of-the-line he could afford. He wasn't taking any chances with theft. Secrets were only worth something if only one living person had them. Pritchard was a loner. He even refused to tell people his given name. He also didn't like the government. He barely had respect for his metaphysical community. Pritchard might not like people, but he didn't necessarily hate them. All. Kaya did a bad thing. A very bad thing. A very unlike her thing, for which she was bound to get into serious trouble. But she was going through a crisis of indecision, and the tear was just there. The law was tears were to be reported immediately so they could be blocked off and repaired. It was a danger to their people if something were to come through. But being responsible for putting all of her people's lives in danger would have serious repercussions. First, she just peered through the ripped space to see if there was anything she could make out. This one showed only darkness. After a few minutes, or several minutes, Kaya became brave enough to shove her hand through the tear into the dark. She was terrified she would be dismembered, or sucked through, or her hand turned to black. But when she pulled it back, it was fine. She was fine. Rumors had it that some had gone through the tears and returned to tell about it. Of course, they were imprisoned for their infraction. But still. Taking a deep breath, Kaya slipped sideways into the tear, being careful not to widen it. She stopped in the darkness and waited, but nothing happened. Then she heard a sound coming from far away, and she realized there was movement just a little bit farther. She stepped forward and found herself in another world, on another plane. She was in so much trouble. Kaya laughed with giddy pleasure. Pritchard stood in a small cemetery in Silver Lake, New Hampshire, over an open grave. It was early September, and the maple and oak leaves were just starting to change from green to red, yellow, and orange. The weather was a little chilly tonight, which was typical of New England. He was ready to get down to business. He liked to work privately, so as soon as the diggers unearthed the coffin, he sent them back into the town until he was done. He had all of his tools in the pockets of his vintage brown bomber jacket. This was his favorite part of the job. Just as he was about to start, Pritchard heard a rustle in the trees just beyond the graveyard fence. Thinking it was an animal, he hoped it wasn't a polecat because he really didn't want to get sprayed. Then he ignored it and took out a polished stone. As he dropped it into the hole, he heard a sudden muted burst of giggling, and it completely ruined his mood. He wondered if there were some teenagers hiding in the forest waiting to take photos of the zombie he was about to raise. Cool for them, not cool for him. He left his place and went to the edge of the tree line. "All right, come out," he told the giggler. "I've got a right to be here, but if you don't show yourselves, I'm calling the cops." He waited a moment, and then pulled out his e-phone. "You had your chance." "Wait," he heard. Pritchard froze in place. It was like hearing an angel of God speaking from heaven. Her voice had chimes in it, freaking bells in the sound. He wasn't sure if he was breathing in some sort of toxic airborne spray or something. He covered his mouth and nose with his leather-covered arm and hoped it would do some good. It didn't. A woman stepped through the maze of trees, as delicate as if she were at a ball. Pritchard had never seen anything more beautiful, more perfect in his entire life. His arm dropped back down as he stared at her. Her dark hair had blue highlights in the reflection of the moon. It went from the crown of her head into two complicated braids down to her bottom. Her skin appeared pale cerulean in the shadows. Pritchard didn't care that it didn't make sense. On her it was soft and silky looking. He had never seen such wide violet eyes with thick dark lashes and a short, upturned nose, which bent just precisely at the tip. The shape of her face, cheeks, and chin were delicate, though pointed, and she had tiny lips that pursed together in a bow. Pritchard didn't even look past the gorgeousness of that face to admire her body, which was a first for him. He was entranced by her, enthralled. He should run in the other direction, but he didn't want to move ever again. Finally, he found his voice. "Who are you?" "Kaya," she answered in that wind chime voice, which shouldn't be possible and should be annoying him. I'm not supposed to be here." "It's okay," he said quickly, offering a hand to her. "Would you like to watch?" The woman frowned slightly, but even the scowl that appeared between her perfect brows made her appear goddess-like. I suppose." Pritchard took her hand to help her step over the low black iron fencing. Her skin was as silky as it appeared, and warm as sunshine. She wore a complicated, long pantsuit, which she watched carefully so it wouldn't get caught in the spikes of the fence. Pritchard thought the style must be something new and trendy. "What were you doing?" she asked him, once she was on the cemetery ground. He tipped his head at that, surprised. "Raising a zombie." "Oh," she replied. He could tell she was still a bit uncertain about what she was going to be witnessing shortly. He took her arm gently and led her over to the grave. He decided to show her. "I've already thrown in a carnelian stone, which will enhance my psychic strength," he told her. He took out 3 different colored ribbons braided together. "These will help bind the zombie to me." Tossing them in, he took out a bag of herbs. "These are a mix that will thin the veil between this plane and the next." He tossed it in, and she grabbed his arm. "You know how to create tears between worlds?" she asked him, a bit excitedly. "It's just thinning the wall. Spirits can pass through because they have no corporeal form. It doesn't create an actual pathway." He hated to disappoint her. She looked so anxious for a moment. She nodded and let go of him. He missed her touch. He took out the fragrant oils in a glass bottle representing sacrifice when the bottle was smashed. It released the potent scents to do their work to lure the spirit to him. He threw in a small piece of fabric which had come from an item belonging to the deceased, which would help the dead to connect with him. Lastly, he slit his palm and allowed 7 drops of blood to fall into the grave. He spoke the words of resurrection, and the air changed. As he chanted the spell, his vision narrowed on the thinning of the barrier between planes. He saw the spirit hover over the casket, then slam into place. He was left feeling woozy and sick, but he manned up with Kaya there. There was a thump, then a crack, and an explosion of wood fragments as the zombie woke and opened his coffin. He pushed the plastic from his eyes and pulled the sutures from his mouth before staring up at Pritchard. Pritchard smiled. This was his favorite part. Not just getting those secrets, but having complete control of a zombie for a little while. The power was a rush. Kaya could not believe how stupid she was. Going through a tear in the barrier between planes was forbidden for a reason. She had gone from a bit in trouble to imprisonment for life infractions. She interacted with what she believed were called humans. From what she could tell, this one was male. He had a very deep, rough voice and a slight bulge between his legs like the males from her world did. The important thing was, he was very different than any male on her plane. To start, his skin was varying shades of brown and covered with hair, dark hair in spots. She'd felt it on the back of his hand and could see it growing on his face. A face with hard planes and a square jaw, a chin with a dent off-center. Underneath all of that thick, dark gold hair were changeable eyes, which squinted when he looked at her. And his bold, long, straight nose led to a perfect pair of wide, thin lips. Kaya talked to him. She touched him. She lusted for ultimate pleasure with this male, if his people even knew what that was. She had heard rumors of her people seducing humans as well. She couldn't just leave without trying. He finished raising his zombie and then released the body. "So, what did you think?" He was smiling at her, and Kaya wanted to please him. "I would like very much to join in pleasure with you. Would you tell me your name?" His eyes became very wide at her announcement, but he answered her. "James," he said. "My name is James." "James." She let the word roll off her tongue. It was unique and sexy, like the man. Kaya stepped close to him and leaned into his chest, pressing her hands flat against his biceps. Do you desire exploration of my body? He looked down at her curiously. Damn straight, woman. Pritchard had no idea why he was agreeing to have sex with this goddess among women. Obviously, it was some sort of prank being pulled on him. No one who looked like her would look twice at somebody as ordinary as him. But he was willing to take it as far as it would go. He had a hotel room for the night. Cops like to pull people over when they drove at night. He'd take her to the hotel and see how far this went. Pritchard sent a quick message to his diggers to come and take care of the unearthed grave and offered Kaya his hand. She took it somewhat eagerly, and he shook his head, thinking she was a rather good actress. She could have the world at her feet. He brought her out of the cemetery to his car and opened up the SUV with his handprint. Newer models would open on voice command, but again, Pritchard was a cheap guy. He noticed Kaya's skin remained a tinge of blue, even in the brightness of the parking lot lights, and he figured it was a part of the allure. He wondered how much of her body she had covered in non-smearing body paint. It would be interesting to find out. Once they were both in the vehicle, Pritchard turned down his loud classic rock and asked if she was hungry. It was around dinner time, and he hadn't eaten yet, so he figured he'd be as much of a gentleman as he knew how. Only for you, her tinkling voice responded. Pritchard actually got semi-aroused from just that statement. He figured he could eat afterward. This gorgeous creature might be on a time limit, and he had already wasted 40 minutes or so on his resurrection. He pulled into the hotel parking lot and pulled into the nearest empty spot. Walking into the lobby with Kaya earned them a few curious looks, but Pritchard didn't care. He knew there were those who would wonder at the mismatch of beauty and plainness. There were those who would wonder at the creamy blue hue of her skin, but he couldn't care less. He was already checked in, and he took Kaya directly to the lifts to get to his room. When the elevator doors opened, Kaya balked at getting into the metal box. "I don't like this," she said firmly, a hint of fear in her voice. Pritchard slid a hand to the small of her back in a comforting fashion. "Well, we can take the stairs if you don't mind the climb," he countered. "I don't mind climbing," she replied, with a relieved intake of breath. He led her over to the stairwell, and they began the ascent to the 7th floor. Pritchard wasn't in bad physical condition, but this wasn't his usual daily routine. He knew he was bound to get winded by the time they reached where they were going. He hoped he didn't embarrass himself, more than he already had. Kaya took the steps as if she used a stair-climbing machine every morning before breakfast. She was steady and swift and relentless. Pritchard figured she had claustrophobia, but now he kind of wished he'd talked her into taking the elevator. He kept up with her in pace, but his breathing wasn't the best when he stopped her at the correct floor. "We're here," he grunted, gratefully noting the bold number 7. Kaya turned to him and embraced him briefly and awkwardly. "Thank you. I knew you would have preferred the box." At that, Pritchard laughed, even winded. If he wasn't mistaken, this glorious creature really meant to spend the night with him, or at least a few enjoyable hours. He was amazed that this was not some sort of scam or dream. He wondered where she had come from, that he, of all people, would be a choice for a lover. He wasn't going to do anything that might mess this up. He took her through the door down the hall and led her into his simple room with a queen-size bed and little in the way of other accommodations. It was the cheapest available reservation they had, but now it looked it. Pritchard wondered if Kaya would be turned off by that. She went immediately to the bed and sat on it, bouncing a little. "Is this where you sleep?" she asked, smoothing her hands over the bedspread. For tonight, yeah, he answered. I live in North Conway, so I have a place there. Ah, she replied with understanding. You are borrowing this place for a night's rest. She tipped her head and studied him carefully. Is it all right that we use this place for pleasure? He grinned. She said the strangest things. He wondered if it was some sort of character she liked to play, but it didn't bother him. He went to her and crouched down in front of her, putting his hand on her knee. Anything goes. Kaya was mesmerized by the man named James. He was everything a male of her species was not. Rough and aggressive instead of gentle and passive. She couldn't wait to have him naked with her. She only hoped that their parts roughly fit together similarly. If not, that could be interesting. He was crouched down in front of her, grinning, and Kaya couldn't resist running her hands through his thick gold hair. It felt like heaven, rough in places, soft in others. She grasped it in her hands, causing him to raise his dark golden brows to her. Like it a little rough, do you? He asked her. She didn't quite know if that was true, but it sounded exciting, and so she nodded. I can accommodate that, he added. He rose from his knees, leaving her hands to slip from his hair. He took off his outer clothing and dumped it on the floor. Then he turned a bit and picked her up sideways, bringing her a few feet and tossing her onto the middle of the bed. A little thrill went through Kaya as she bounced on the soft surface. This would be no listless mating. James removed his top and revealed a chest that was bronzed and hairy, and Kaya immediately rose up to touch. As she ran her hands all over the amazing body in front of her, James began to attempt removal of her top as well. Oh, she said apologetically. With a twist and a tug, she loosened the material and it fell away from her body, leaving her breast bared to the man. She hoped human females were built similarly, or there were about to be many questions. James put his rough, calloused hands over her smooth skin and captured her breasts in his hands. Damn, he swore softly. Even your body is perfect. She hoped he still thought so upon seeing her bottom half, but she was distracted by his attentions. His touch was the most pleasurable balance of aggressive and tender. She couldn't quite catch her breath. When he leaned his furred chest up against her, she found the sensation so incredible, her eyes rolled back in her head for a moment. James was kissing and nibbling at her neck, and she found she quite enjoyed the surprise of not knowing what he would do next. Then she felt him tug at her trousers. Okay, beautiful, he said, leaning up and looking into her eyes. I need to see all of you. Kaya complied without protest. She reached between them, her hand brushing against his pants and feeling something very stiff at the juncture of his thighs. She sighed in pure happiness, presuming this meant they would be absolutely compatible in the giving and receiving of pleasure. Undoing the tie at her waist, Kaya began to wriggle out of her pantaloons. James groaned and his eyes closed. Then he stood abruptly and helped wrench the clothes from her lower half. He slid the shoes from her feet, then slowly looking up the length of her legs to focus on the gateway of her sexual pleasure. He didn't act repulsed or curious as Kaya had feared. His changeable eyes were bright green and intent upon her. Then his gaze shot to her face, and he undid his own clothing and stripped them from his body. He stood naked before her for a moment, as if giving her a chance to turn back, to reject him, and to change her mind. She caught a glimpse of strong, hairy thighs, but Kaya couldn't stop staring at the jutting pride between his legs. Before she could stop herself, she leaned forward and began stroking him. He was silkiness over stone, and she couldn't believe the size of him. He was shaped a bit differently than the males of her kind, with 2 balls hanging in the sack below his member, but Kaya could live with it. Then, suddenly, James pushed her away. Pritchard thought he would explode right there, and he was not about to embarrass himself in that way. He pushed Kaya away from him quickly and shoved her gently back on the bed. She fell arms akimbo, legs spread, a flushed look on her face, a sexual invitation in her gaze. "Are you sure that you want to have sex with me?" he growled for form, uncertain he could leave now if he tried. She simply nodded. Pritchard fell upon her, his chest matched to her chest, his groin matched to her groin. Positioning himself, he slowly slid into her, and she was transported to an alternate universe. Her body was so perfectly tight around him, so soft and wet. Her sex sucked at him as if urging him to action without regret, and James began to ride her hard. His hips pumped furiously against her as he watched her expressions. She was so turned on. She was mewling and moaning with desire. Every thrust he made sent her arching against him, her head dropping back involuntarily. Finally, he witnessed an amazing sight, one he'd never thought to see. Her violet eyes went deep purple, and she made a sound caught between a sigh and a scream. Her body spasmed, and she clenched him so tightly he couldn't hold back. As he watched her orgasm, he rocked the bed, coming to sweet satisfaction himself. Shaky and spent, he hovered over her, his elbows crooked on either side of her body. "Kaya," he grumbled, barely able to speak. "Who are you?" She slid her arms along his until she had them wrapped around his neck. She pulled his face down to hers and kissed him. Emotion so powerful, so deep and life-altering ran through him as her bow lips pulled at his and her tongue tangled with his. Pritchard was fairly certain he was falling in love with a complete stranger. Typical of his life. When she broke the kiss, she smiled at him. "I will tell you, but you must promise to keep my secret from all humans in this world." She was asking him, the keeper of secrets, the master of the craft, to protect her confidence. He could do that. "I promise," he agreed. Kaya rolled him to the side and sat up, not covering herself in any way, but unashamedly leaving herself bare to him. He tried to ignore her body and focus on what she was telling him. "I came here through a tear in the barrier between planes of existence," she began slowly. "I was supposed to report it, but I was feeling rebellious and angry. It was my 57th birthday, and I was expected to comply with the elders' choice of occupation for me. I did not like their offer, so I did not report the tear. I went through instead. I was not supposed to interact with your species. When I return, if I am caught, I will likely be imprisoned. If they find out I have shared pleasure with a human, the sentence will be severe, perhaps the rest of my life. But I don't care, because it was worth it, and I'd like to do it again." She leaned forward, her hand on his chest, but Pritchard regretfully stopped her. "Hold on," he said, disbelieving her tale. "If you're not human, then what are you?" "A fairy," she replied. "Although, beside coloring, I see we are outwardly, physically similar. This was a relief for me. Your source of pleasure is much larger than our males, but I quite enjoyed it." Pritchard struggled with pride at the compliment and a growing mistrust of the beauty before him. "I don't believe in fairies," he stated, "and you're kind of life-size to be one, anyway." A scowl formed on her angelic brow, and she frowned, but it was still incredibly sexy. "There are stories that my people have interacted with your kind before. They have even shared pleasure with humans on occasion. Haven't you heard the same?" "Yeah, well, there's a reason why they're called fairy tales." She waited. When he said nothing else, she said, "I don't understand." "Fairy tales are fantasy stories that are made up and people wish were true," Pritchard explained. "So, therefore, by definition, fairies are fantasy." "Do I look like a fantasy to you?" she demanded softly. He couldn't stop his reply. "Well, hell yes. You're every man's fantasy come to life. I'm not sure this isn't some amazing drug I'm on, but if so, it's one hell of a hallucination." She put her hand on his member and stroked the semi-hardening flesh. It responded immediately. "I am real, James. I am a fairy, and I can only stay with you for a few more hours. I have no time to waste convincing you of my truth. I wish to share more pleasurable desires with you. What do you wish to do?" He pulled her down to him, enjoying her hand's firm stroke, and kissed her deeply. Despite the mass of tangled emotions it engendered, he wished to taste her. He didn't want to waste any more time. Kaya felt in her nerve endings that it was time to go before she missed her window to return home. She and James had enjoyed each other's bodies multiple times in these few hours they had together. He was angry and complimentary all at once, and it made Kaya feel all that more attracted to him. But time was up. "James," she nudged his sleeping form, "would you bring me back to the woods now?" He reacted by reaching for her automatically, his body primed for another go at exchanging pleasure. His hands encountered clothing this time, and it seemed to rouse him awake. "You're leaving?" "I must," she answered. "I fear someone has found and reported the tear. If I don't go back now, I may be stuck here." "Would that be so bad?" he said with a sexy grin. She responded by rolling her eyes at him. "Please, James, I haven't much time." He seemed to recognize the urgency in her voice this time. He got up off the bed and began dressing immediately. It didn't take them long before they were back in his transport vehicle, headed back to the forest. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her as they rode. "It's dark, and I don't like leaving you in a cemetery." "You can come with me," she offered. "After you see me to the tear, perhaps you'll feel better about our parting." He looked askance at her, but nodded. We can do that." Kaya recognized that James didn't believe her confession about who she was. He might feel differently after seeing proof. She only hoped it didn't turn him against her in fear or revulsion. She had heard tales of humans who tried to use fairies for their psychic energy, but she could sense James had plenty of his own. They reached the place called the cemetery and James walked with Kaya to the place he had found her. With the light from his calling device, they entered the woods and made their way to the tear. It was right where it was supposed to be. But Kaya still felt a weird sense of urgency to return home. She turned to James to wish him well and to thank him for treating her body to such unmatched delights. He was blank-faced, staring at her, not even blinking. "James? James?" she called and touched him, but there was no response. She was afraid she may have broken him. Pritchard had seen lots of amazing things in his life. He was a metaphysical being with metaphysical contacts all over the world. He knew about scientific connection between the energy of the earth and all of its creatures, including humans. He did not believe in magic. But he was standing next to a rift in the fabric of the universe, next to a woman who claimed to be a fairy, a woman he had just enjoyed sex with multiple times in multiple positions. He was pretty certain he was certifiably insane. "James!" Kaya was calling to him anxiously, and he knew he ought to respond, but it was so difficult to wrap his head around what was real or imagined. "I have to go. Please, look at me." Her plea had made it through the sticky mess his brain had become, and he turned to her, acknowledging her call. "You're real," he said. "Yes," she told him, her smile relieved. "Thank you so much for everything, but I must return to my world before it's too late." She made to step into the rift, and he grabbed her arm to stop her. "Wait," he protested. "You said they would punish you if you're caught. You can't go back." "The fairy world is where I belong, James. I will always remember you." She kissed him intensely and slid out of his grasp, stepping into the light. The next moment, he was alone, standing in the middle of the night, in the middle of the woods, watching as a tear between the planes of existence seemed to repair itself. Then, he was staring at nothing but trees. Fairies were real. He'd just let the most beautiful one walk out of his life forever. And he had no idea how sex would ever match up to the standard of what happened tonight. Pritchard turned and left the forest. He left the graveyard. He went back to the motel and collected all of his things. He checked out and drove home. He crawled into his own bed in his own apartment and fell into a hard sleep. He drifted off without a care if he ever woke up again.
And that's our story. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this podcast, head to patreon.com/nobilis. As a supporter, you will have access to a personal RSS feed that you can drop into your podcatcher. And if you want monthly bonus content, bump up your support to $3 a month. And of course, remember to pick up Monster Whisperer Second Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website. You can also pick up the audiobook on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.